Okay, Dr. Slane, while we have you up here in Cairns, I have more questions and more information I want to pull out about the step test we did the other day. Now, we alluded to being able to calculate your VO2 max, and a few very sharp people noted we didn't cover that. So I think it's a video all in itself.
Yep, fire away.
Excellent. First of all, what is VO2 max and what does it mean?
Technically, VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen your body can uptake and use per minute. So it's got nothing to do with, a lot of people get confused, it's not how much air you take into your lungs, it is how much oxygen gets used by the working muscles.
Right, what does it actually predict? Because we hear this number thrown around all the time, across multiple sports as well. What does your VO2 predict?
VO2 is probably the best predictor of performance for endurance athletes, I guess. Like ultimately, anything endurance that lasts longer than 3 minutes is technically an endurance type event. So the more oxygen your body can use, the more or the higher the intensity you can sustain without metabolically fatiguing. Because you have aerobic energy production, you also have anaerobic energy production. There's no nasty byproducts under aerobic energy production. I think it's just CO2 and water. If it's anaerobic, you get byproducts like lactic acid, which is associated with changes in acidity in the blood and things like that. And you fatigue relatively quickly depending upon how anaerobic any activity happens to be.
Okay, right. So it's, I guess, global across a lot of sports. We see cross-country skiers, I think, have the highest VO2s, or is it the Nordic skiers?
It's usually
the ones?
pretty high, I'd say, because one, potentially they're at altitude, maybe, and two, it is very much a whole body sport. So if you measure VO2 cross-country skiing, it's arms, it's legs, it's glutes, it's everything.
And rowing's the same, I guess, too.
Rowing's similar,
yep.
And cycling is your upper body's not doing a great deal. So generally we see runners or running VO2 for triathletes and cycling VO2. You'll probably get a higher one when you're running.
Right, okay. And what are the limitations of a VO2 value? Let's say I test at 70. What would I expect once I start training? And how much can I move that VO2 value?
Well, I suppose, first of all, we need to define what that 70 is. So that is 70 mils of oxygen per kilogram of body mass. So that's generally, that's called the relative number. The absolute number is that 70 mils expressed in absolute litres. So you have essentially two ways of describing VO2 max. The first one is the easiest to do is absolute, and that's what our equation will predict later on when we get to it. But then we can transcribe that into your relative VO2 max, which means we can compare between people. So you've got a VO2 max in litres per minute, and then you've got a relative VO2 max in mils per kilogram per minute.
But what I've always been told is that if I've got a VO2 of 70, I can't train that to 90 because I do have a genetic potential, I guess, or a genetic
Correct.
ceiling.
So there's the rare few people that might have a VO2 max of 90 mils per kilogram per minute. They are blessed with good genes. There's the rest of the population, a well-trained athlete might be up around 60 mils or so, somewhere around there. I see a lot of good athletes up around 60 to 70 mils for a male and somewhere between maybe 55, 65 for a female.
Okay, so now onto the calculations. Using the test that we did the other week, I'll put a link below to the step test and they're the values we use. Now we're looking, the number we use, I guess, is the PPO or the MAP value from our step test.
Yep, so we call it different things. Some tests call it a peak power output. I'll try and, for the reference of this, what we're going to go through, the paper that this is all referenced off calls it peak power output. So for this, the sake of this, I'll call it peak power output. I think they call it watts max in the equation. It's also maybe called your MAP, or your maximal aerobic power.
All right, now let's run through the calculation of how that's done when you've got those values.
All right, so before we get to the equation, we need to understand that there is a relationship between power and oxygen consumption, and it's a linear correlation. So if we say here on our graph we have O2 We'll say it's VO2. It's a V and a dot. That means volume of oxygen. And on this side we have power expressed in watts. And I'll say this is VO2 in litres per minute. So funnily enough, the more power you're doing, the more oxygen it takes to produce that power. So there's a linear relationship between the two, which means we know if you are doing, say, 400 watts, that is using 5 litres of oxygen. It's as simple as that. So there's an equation or a regression from that line that actually allows us to predict that. And that equation comes from this study that we've referenced, this Hawley Noakes 1992 paper. That was because they had a group of cyclists come in, like as many as they can get pretty much. And each one of those athletes that gets tested, like they test their VO2, we can pretty much put each one of these dots represents a cyclist. The ones that got right up the top, of course, are doing the 400s, others would have been lower. But then we get what we call a regression line or a line of best fit, and there's an equation that goes with that. And essentially the equation that we're going to use is that equation that allows us to calculate VO2 from power.
Okay, given it's an equation based on a massive sample size, how accurate is this?
In that research paper, it was 97% accurate. So that, what we get scientifically is an R squared value, and that R squared was 0.97. So 1 is perfect. This was 0.97, which means this equation can predict it 97% accurately. So 97 out of 100, it's pretty darn close.
That's not bad. So again, just to cover what we're doing here, you've run a step test at home, got your PPO figure, and using this equation, you can predict your VO2 max within a 97% accuracy of a lab environment.
Correct.
Right.
But there's a couple of catches.
Yep.
So usually with any study, they'll use cyclists that are of a similar ability or training status. So these were, I would believe, just what we call well-trained cyclists. So they probably fell into a certain, they might have been, usually we say these athletes rode somewhere between maybe 12 and 20 hours a week, so which classifies them as a well-trained athlete. They might have been doing it for the last minimum of 3 years. So they're active, trained cyclists. If you're a recreational cyclist, only ride a couple of days a week, you might not be as efficient as a trained cyclist, so therefore this equation might not work as well. Okay,
so there are some outliers, but the general population on a bell curve, this is pretty much in the centre.
Yeah.
And we'll give you a good estimate.
Now the other catch is that these were all males. So for females,
yep,
this predictive equation tends to over-predict, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
And I've seen that with some of the females that I coach. But with the males, so for myself in particular, I've had my VO2 max tested heaps of times, and it's usually somewhere between 68 and 72 mils per kilogram per minute, depending upon how much I weigh, because weight comes into it. And this equation always predicts, so you usually get to 400 watts at about 67, 68 kilos, and that's always about 72 mils per kilogram per minute. So it matches up, predicted versus measured.
Right, so this study was done in 1992 for the males,
yep,
and for the females though, I hear there's an ongoing test right now to get those kind of figures.
So at one of the girls, Evelyn Parr, who I did my PhD at the same time as, in at ACU University in Melbourne, are doing exactly the same study now to see what the equation is for females, because we know it over predicts.
Excellent.
And she's also doing a validity study of this one, where she's potentially going to get males in and see if this was repeatable, to see if it's doable.
And that's 20, 30 years later or so, I guess.
Yeah,
but it's good to see.
It'll be interesting to see. It's actually my supervisor and her supervisor, John Hawley, is the guy who was part of the first paper. He was first author.
Okay, it's a good wrap up of what we're looking at, the accuracy of it, and I guess the real world examples of you using that as well in your lab. to test your athletes to verify this. The scientific papers, I guess, already verify it, but real world is always good to see that it backs that up. Now, let's get into the meat and potatoes of what this calculation actually is and how we do it.
All right. Well, I'll use the same graph as what we had, and I'll run through how this actually works and how you can do it yourself if you want to. So typically, if we did a step test or our PPO test, it would have looked like this. So we go, here's our watts, step, 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 step. So they're our stages, 2.5 minutes every 25 watts every 2.5 minutes. Say our athlete, for the sake of this, I'll say the stage they reached and finished was 400 watts. Actually, to make the example better, I should actually say they lasted 120 seconds into the 400 watt stage. So the numbers you need from this are last completed stage. So if they didn't make it through 400, that would be 375 watts.
So the math we're doing right here is already covered in our how to do a step test video, but we'll just go over I guess the fundamentals of what we need to do to get to our PPO value.
Yep, so I'm going to call this final completed is 375. I'm going to say final uncompleted equals 400. Now you've got to remember, and this is the important part, how long did you last into that 400 watt stage? For this instance, I'm going to say it was 120 seconds. Now each stage is 2.5 minutes, which is 150. So for that, we go 120 divided by 150, and we get that as a percentage. So let's go 120 divided by 150. There you go, that equals 0.8. So that's a fraction of that last stage. They completed 80% of that final stage. So then we go 0.8, a fraction of that stage, times by 25 watts, because each stage goes up by 25 watts. So effectively we'll go 20 watts plus that final completed stage. So it's 20 plus 375 equals 395 watts.
395 watts. And that's the PPO or the MAP or what was the other terminology they used, the power watts max?
It's your power at VO2 max. So as simple as that. Now that's not the actual equation.
No.
But that's the important number you need to feed into it.
This is the output of the step test, and that calculation is also in that video as well, and the video notes, I guess, on YouTube for that. So if you need to know how to calculate that, this is all in the previous video. Now, from this, how do we get our VO2?
All right, here's the key one. So we've got 395 as our PPO. So if you want to figure out where 395 sits, we'll say it's just there. Where does that sit on the chart? Down like this. So it's going to be pretty close. That's not a very straight line, but that'll do. VO2 in litres per minute equals, here's your number, 0.01141 times by this number here. So your PPO. So let's do it as we go.
All these numbers will be in the show notes below as well.
So it is 0.01141 times by 395 equals 4.5. So that goes 4.5. We'll round it down to that. Now there's an extra bit. And then you've got a plus 0.435. And that 0.435 is actually how much oxygen it takes to pedals without any resistance on there at all. That's actually what it takes. It takes about half a litre just to turn pedals without any oxygen, or sorry, any load on the cranks.
Oh, that has to be factored into as well.
Yep, so right. It's 4.5 plus 0.435 equals, there you go, 4.94 litres per minute. So I said before 400 equals.
So 4.94 is very close to 5, which was the prediction for 400 watts. You're just below that. That validates what I see here. That calculation looks pretty good.
Yep, so this athlete can, at VO2 Max, 395 watts, is using 4.94 litres of oxygen per minute.
Right.
Now that's our absolute value, so you've got to get that into mils per kilogram per minute. There's one more step.
One more step to get to our VO2 value.
Here it is. So 4.94 litres, you want to get it into mils, so you got to times it by 1,000. So it's 4.94 times by 1,000. Of course, it's 4,941. Okay, the only unknown I have here is how much this athlete weighs. So let's say they're a pretty good athlete, and we'll say they weigh 60 kilos. They're doing nearly 400 watts at 60 kilos. We go 4,941 divided by 60. So this person's VO2 is 82.36 mils per kilogram per minute. So they're upper end of elite, I would say.
Now that value, all from your step test from our previous video.
Yep, so there's lots of numbers as part of this. And I think that is why, and I know you had a couple of comments about, oh, a ramp test is better to figure out your VO2 max, or a ramp test it's not a step test. It doesn't go up and up and up. I like to use this one because there's lots of predictive equations. If I wanted to just know what your VO2 max is and I actually had the capacity to measure what your VO2 max is with a computer and the oxygen analysis machinery, yes, a ramp test is probably just as good a way to do it, if not better. But for the sake of this can be done at home. I do it with all of my athletes. I don't have a $30,000 metabolic cart to measure it. So this is as good as measuring it for my sake. Like, you can't prescribe exercise to an athlete based upon going right at 50% of VO2 max, as in mils in oxygen consumption, but you can with power, which is good. So now you have this comparison between power output and oxygen consumption. If I say to you, go out and ride at 100% of your VO2 max, for this athlete, they're going to be doing intervals at 395 watts.
Okay, given the math involved, let's run through athlete X again, start to finish, so people can get an idea of the calculations involved.
All right, so once you've got your numbers, here's how to do it in a step-by-step format. We have athlete X weighs 60 kilograms. He's done his step test, and his peak power output, or his MAP, or his power VO2 max, whatever you want to call it, was 395 watts. Done your step test, done the hard work, now it's time to do the maths. So to get to our one where we compare between athletes is mils per kilogram per minute, we start with your VO2 in litres per minute. So here's the equation. We did the maths. The equation actually is 0.01141 times by your PPO plus 0.435. So I've substituted PPO as 395 to get 4.94 litres a minute. Now we've got to convert that litres per minute into mils. So we times it by 1,000. That gives us 4,941 mils, plus or minus a little bit. Then to get it into mils per kilogram per minute, you simply divide it by your body mass to get our relative VO2 max of 82.36 mils per kilo per minute.
So there we go. A very low cost or almost no cost way of getting a figure or getting an accurate value that will cost you maybe a couple of hundred in a lab.
Yep, so this sort of test is usually at least a few $100 maybe.
Yep.
But a VO2 number is all pretty much about bragging rights as opposed to anything else. It's not that useful to actually apply to anything unless you're a scientist trying to quantify your cohort of athletes. To your normal everyday person, power is more usable.
That's a really good summary of what it is a follow-up from the other video we've already done on the step test and how to apply some, I guess, PhD mathematics to get your number.
Basic science, pretty easy. There's lots of these equations out there for all sorts of things. You just gotta read lots of journal articles to figure them out.
That's what you love doing, and that's what we love filming, so we'll bring you more soon.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.